What's at risk is the loss of a more complete picture of the history of this country and the people who have toiled, contributed to it, and have lived in it and still live in it. And when you don't have a complete picture of history, it almost makes you blind to context, to what's going on right now and what can happen in the future. So you really need to have a complete picture of what happened to be able to deal with the here and now, and especially in the future.
Are you worried about what could happen if pressure from the federal government grows and the future of the Library of Congress is in jeopardy?
The Library of Congress serves Congress and the people Congress serves. So you're talking about every American. Every member of Congress represents a community. And so we are really trying to make sure that members understand that what happens at the Library of Congress affects the people that they serve. And we're making sure that they understand that we serve them, but also the people who put them in place.
Now, of course, you have the distinct honor of being the first Black person to lead the Library of Congress. And this comes, you also are serving at a time where 5 months after your appointment, there was a new law enacted by a Republican majority that position that once was a once-in-a-lifetime appointment now has to be renewed.
Well, I'm smiling because I'm also the first female in the position since 1802. So the first person of color, the first female in a feminized profession to lead the library. But I'm smiling because I was part of a group of librarians that were consulted when my predecessor, Dr. James Billington, who was Librarian of Congress for 28 years, because it was similar to the Supreme Court, a lifetime appointment. And we recommended, the library community recommended that the Library of Congress position, because of the changing nature of libraries, so much is going on, that you have the option of a renewal of a term, that you actually have a term, 10 years, and it can be renewed, but that you recognize that libraries might not be the types of institutions where a lifetime appointment is appropriate. And there were conspiracy theories about, well, the first woman and the first Black person, and now they're going to put a term limit on it. I know, I remember it was out there.
Time for that to be happening,
But that's also interesting too, in terms of how different things are being interpreted through a different lens. So what might have been ordinary, or what might have been that, now is definitely looked in a different way.
Well, given that in September 2026, this renewal is going to come up, are you worried?
I would be honored to be able to finish out my term that I have now, and really interested to see how it would turn out in terms of reappointment or possibility of that.
So, Dr. Trent, we talked about the attack that the federal government is mounting on museums like yours. And in fact, recently, the administration has pushed an effort to remove the sit-in exhibit from the National Museum of African American History. If something like that were to happen at your museum, what would you do?
Well, you know, that's been a discussion really since January about as we're doing risk assessments, what are the risks to our objects. Essentially, museums are like cemeteries. Things go in, they don't come out, right? And so I think there's been a little bit of misinformation around what was happening at the Smithsonian, and that something was returned. Things are returned when they're loaned, right? And so if the loan agreement is up and they say, you know, they make a number of different decisions, then the loan is returned. If something's been formally accessioned, it is in the museum's holdings, and there it will stay. Now, there are questions about, can they be removed? That's actually quite an involved process, right? So we just can't go in and take things out of the museum. Should someone want to try to do that, we are an independent 501c3, so those items in our collection, which we hold for the public trust to make accessible to the public, they would have to come up against the museum as an entity, right? And we're fully prepared to do everything that we're supposed to do ethically and legally to protect the collections.
And what are some of those options that you have?
Well, some of those options is, first of all, museums generally don't display everything they have in their holdings. Maybe 1% of what we have is on display. I think with the Library of Congress, maybe it's 1 to 3%.
So there's a whole bunch of stuff somewhere that people
In the
haven't even
stacks,
seen.
in the stacks.
Interesting.
See, I used to live at the Library of Congress when I was in graduate school, so there's like tunnels below. There's stuff everywhere.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Will that ever see the light of day?
People can actually request to see an item.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that happens. People
Okay.
request from us too. Like you can request to see an item, but we make the determination around how those go out. We have loaned them to other institutions. So last year when the Met held their Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism exhibit, we had a sculpture by Meta Warwick Fuller go to New York, and it's now I think in DC at one of the museums. So all of those things happen all the time, and scholars can write and say, I would love to take a look at this art piece or this artifact. All of that's part of the work that we do. But no one can come in and just take things out, right? And the reality is the people who care for these objects, the folks whose responsibility it is day in and day out, the people who know their area of collections inside and out. Like I'm sure you can go to the Library of Congress today and you've got employees where they know their little record group, they know very well, and they can find things in their sleep. They would not let that happen, right? And so we're not here, times change, but one of the things that we're here as institutions to do is to remain steadfast. And part of remaining steadfast is to protect those collections for the future.
Mm-hmm. How are you rethinking the way that you preserve history with this uncertainty about the future?
I think museums across the country are doing a reassessment of how we do business. You are looking at your income structure, your revenue, contributed versus earned, what you get federally versus state. But then also you're thinking about, we've had a lot of conversations over the last 15 years about highlighting multiple voices. Diversity, equity, inclusion became words that everybody started using. Now those words are not really welcomed in the conversation. So how do you do that work? How do you still make sure that you're bringing forth the voices of the different populations, different identities that are present within your collection? And I think those are things that we're still wrestling with. This has been an ever-changing environment. And so we're in constant communication with each other about that, but what we remain committed to is making sure that the story of our work continues to go out, making sure that the public has an opportunity to learn. Because next to libraries, we are one of the most trusted knowledge sources in the country. And we're a major economic driver for the communities that we're in. So if you lose us, you lose a knowledge source and you lose an economic driver. And so we want to make sure that we're here for the long run.
We know that history is passed down in many, many ways, right? It's not always so formalized. People's families tell stories, right? History's passed down that way through music, through other forms of literature, et cetera. When you think about the past and times in which people had to preserve history when they weren't technically legalized to do, legally able to do, are there some things that or some notes that you're taking in this moment to apply to your own work now?
I think about Miss Pendergrass, who, now that I'm a librarian and a professional librarian and realize what she was doing, she was personally collecting, probably without the not approved training or even approval. She was using her own funds to purchase these books and keeping them in a cubicle in the stacks of the Illinois State Library and loaning them to African American children in that Zion Baptist Church. And that's an act of almost resistance, but preservation, that she knew that was important. And Mr. Schomburg in New York started the collection and had to ask basically New York public to accept it. But he knew that gathering those materials was very important, and the people in museums that started early museums in their homes.
In their homes, what I think about is our founder, Sue Bailey Thurman. When she arrives in Boston, she starts looking around and seeing that there's no documentation of Boston's Black history. Where are all the Black abolitionists she learned about? And started documenting where they lived. And because a lot of them lived on Beacon Hill, those houses were still preserved, she created what's now known as the Black Heritage Trail. So I think about not only people who've been able to preserve their buildings, especially Black churches who've been able to stay in their historic buildings, but I think about the people who mark the places where history happens. So regardless of what happens, they say, no, 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 we were here. Let me tell you about this event. And it's not just the written history that I find fascinating, it's those oral histories, those oral traditions, because that's such a part of our culture to hear people, like if you were to go to certain places, like the Boston Common last week with the Freedom Rally 1965, I'm sure that if you walked around, you might have talked to somebody who was at the Freedom Rally in 1965 and could tell you their experience. That is just as valuable as the objects that we preserve and the places that we mark.
It may even become even more valuable
Yes.
as it can't be formalized. So, Dr. Trent, you mentioned that America is coming up on its 250th anniversary. I know it's a real far way in the future, but 250 years from now, how do you want, each of you, how do you want your work to be remembered?
Well, that's a good one.
It's a good one. The aspect that we want, I think you would feel this way too, is that there would be work to be remembered.
Yeah.
That our efforts now to preserve and to collect and to protect information, items that will go into the future, if that happens, I think we will have accomplished something.
Right, because people don't realize you have to take care of things. Like paper's got to get rotated, film's got to be stored the right way. So hoping that those make it another 250 years is really important. When people tour the museum and I take them through, I let them know that the African Meeting House is the oldest historic Black church building in the country. And people who came there were supporting the abolitionist cause. They were donating, they were doing all these actions, and they did it for a future they couldn't see. They knew that what they were investing in was going to be a country beyond their imagination, something they couldn't conceive of. So I think about our work in that we're doing things for a future we cannot see and something we can't even conceive of. But I think about being in graduate school and being in the Library of Congress and going into one of the manuscript rooms and opening up a folder, and the joy you feel when you find a document that verifies a notion that you had. I hope that we can provide that to generations to come.
And it was probably something that Frederick Douglass wrote himself.
Yes, of course.
And there it was.
And I think it's so fascinating, given the work that the Library of Congress has done to preserve Frederick Douglass's writings, and that the Museum of African American History here in Boston and on Nantucket has had a Frederick Douglass holographic that can talk to people of all ages, right? Like, what a testament to how history can stand the test.
Well, and that's what we hope for, right? So we would not be able to do the Frederick Douglass artificial intelligence that we've done as an exhibition had the papers of Frederick Douglass not been preserved, had his books not been preserved, because then we put all of that into our closed data set, and that's how the AI draws the information. So while people feel like they're talking to Douglass, what you're actually doing is talking to an intelligence that has gone through all the papers that we've loaded in and amalgamating an answer to help you understand a little bit more about who he was. That's the benefit of this technology and the historical coming together. And we haven't even loaded in all of his work yet. And so as
back in one of them tunnels, y'all got
exactly.
And the photographs, because
Yes.
Frederick Douglass was one of the most photographed people in the United States, next to Abraham Lincoln, because he knew the power of this new thing called photography. And he made sure that he was photographed.
Yeah, and so for us, that the opportunity that presents in future versions of this AI is how do we evolve the representation of Douglass based on the photographs that we've seen? Can AI pull that together to create a more realistic looking Douglas? That's the opportunity, but none of those opportunities are available to us if we don't do the first steps in preserving these critical elements.
So fascinating. Well, I'm going to let both of you go, but before I do, I'm going to ask you a question that we ask everyone we have on GBH News Rooted. What's one thing that's keeping you rooted? And I'll start with you, Dr. Hayden.
Seeing the reaction of young people who come into the Library of Congress and discover the Blackwell family tree and seeing their great-grandmother on there. That was a moment.
You know what's keeping me rooted these days is the comments from the community about how important the museum is and how angry they are about the loss of our funding, but how they want to help us continue to keep on keeping on.
Well, Dr. Noelle Trent and Dr. Carla Hayden, thank you both so much.
Thank you.